relationship between science at its latest cutting edges and religion, which has been handed down to us through long ages when science knew a lot less than it does now. Questions abound. Can science, as it were, find God, or can it find out about him? Or is its inexorable tendency to find out that he does not and never could exist at all? Russell Stannard, a professor of physics and a Christian, has talked to many of his distinguished colleagues in various disciplines, from astronomy to biology. As ever, there were as many perspectives as there were people. Today, to discuss some of the enormous questions raised, we have, together with Professor Stannard himself, a panel. Lewis Wolpert, Professor of Biology at University College London, Michael Rice, lecturer in biology at Cambridge University and an Anglican priest, and Kitty Ferguson, author of The Fire in the Equations and also the biographer of Stephen Hawking. She's a thought-provoking science writer from the United States. And I think, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, that we should hear your honest reactions to the 4 programmes that you have heard. Lewis Wolpert, you come at them from an atheist viewpoint, as that is your avowed and constant position. What effect did they have on you?
They made me even less religious than I am now. I was very disappointed in the programmes, to be absolutely honest. I'm sorry to say so. I felt that they were totally uncritical. It was as if Russell, who's a very good physicist, suddenly abandoned all his critical faculties and let people make sort of remarks and statements that just filled me with despair. It was like angels. How many angels on a pin? And someone would answer and Russell would say, oh yes, that seems a perfectly good estimate. I felt it was totally uncritical. It also had little side issues, like he introduced genetic pornography, designer genes, as sort of little throwaway lines. So I regret on the whole, I found the programmes very disappointing, and I felt it failed to tackle the central issue of religion for me, which is possibly the only interesting one, and that's the question of whether one needs a religion in order to have morality.
Well, we shall tackle that today, and Russell will reply to some of those points in a moment. But Michael Rice, was that your approach to them, or did you find them stimulating?
I enjoyed them. I found them pretty high-powered. I wondered if, to some extent, they'd succeed most in preaching to the converted, in the sense that I see myself as someone whom I'd naturally assume, unlike Lewis, would be sympathetic towards the programmes. And within the framework of the way in which they're presented, I felt they succeeded.
And Kitty Ferguson?
Well, I was terribly impressed with them. I liked the fact that they were uncritical. I thought it gave everyone a chance to sort of get out on the battlefield with full flags flying and see how much we just fly past one another, how much we actually conflict. I found it very moving. Some of the statements I think were particularly moving. Indeed, I keep thinking of people that I hope will hear them.
Russell Stannard, would you like to come back on any of that, especially perhaps on Lewis?
Especially on Lewis, yes.
Can I just raise one further point? Because probably my fundamental objection to the programme is that I don't believe that religion and science are discussable on the same, as it were, platform. I think they have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with one another.
Maybe that was a good reason for not being critical then in bringing them together.
I can't see the point of discussing them together. It seems to me ludicrous.
Russell?
Well, I would say this, that obviously there are different ways in which you could have handled such a series. I could certainly have done it from a very personal point of view, which I decided not to do. I certainly made clear where I stood on the issues, but that was purely to allow the listener to make their own correction for possible bias. No, I didn't feel that I ought to be criticizing and taking to pieces what people were saying, because if you were in my position, you've always got the chance of having the last word, which I don't think is fair on the people that you've engaged to take part in these programs.
It certainly made for clarity in what they were saying. I mean, I found as a listener, I rather like that limpid feeling that, yeah, this is what they think, this is what I think of them. I mean, I don't know whether Kitty felt this, but she, like me, is, in a sense, an outsider to the world of science, and I found myself saying, do I believe in this scientist? Never mind, do I believe in God? Do I believe in this strange person? But, Russell, what I would be interested to know is whether in the course of making the programmes and reading for them and talking to people, did you encounter any argument which momentarily shook your conviction that there is a God?
Not at all. In fact, I don't think I came across any arguments which I was not familiar with. There were times when I was taken aback, simply because I didn't expect those particular responses from those particular people. For example, with Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who is a very leading figure in the Quaker movement, she was very reticent to be ascribing to God the idea that he was a creator, and I just was momentarily sort of taken aback by that.
You had felt, as it were, on safe ground there, and
that's right.
suddenly
And
it was cut from
suddenly
under your feet.
That's right. But I think, generally speaking, what I was trying to do was to allow people to have their say and allow the listener to make up their own minds as to which of these varying viewpoints was the one that appealed to them most. And it wasn't up to me to tell them.
Well, let's, before we go into detail, just tackle Lewis's other point. You don't feel that we should be discussing religion and science in the same breath at all. Do you think they're
Absolutely
different
not.
animals?
Totally. Sorry, there's nothing that I have to say about religion and science that David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, didn't say 10 million times better. And Hume made it perfectly clear that science is based on reason, religion is based on faith. And I'm afraid there is no meeting point between them whatsoever.
Can I comment on that? Because, of course, Hume quite explicitly came from an atheistic perspective, which at that time was rather more shocking than it is now. And far be it from me to claim one can put something better than Hume. But I think there are questions which both science and religion look at, questions about meaning, for example, where they are both looking at the same issue.
Sorry, science does not look at meaning.
Well, that's its answer, you see. That's the point.
But, I mean, religion does look at fact. Religion says to you, God is. God always was. So if science seems to be tending to either finding that there is a God behind things or that there can't be a God behind things, surely that is worth discussing.
No, but science doesn't do that. Science is silence on the presence of a God. There's no evidence. I mean, the astonishing thing, once again in the programme, is that Russell was very sort of reticent to ask anybody what the basis of their belief was. Why did they believe in all these extraordinary
May I
things?
comment on that? It seems to me, as an individual looking at the world and trying to decide what's what. If you're a scientist, if you've never had any experience of God, you're dealing with a certain body of data there. If you are an individual who believes that science is a valid way of looking at the universe and learning about it, but also you have had experience of God in your life, then in order to make sense of all this is a much bigger body of data. It's richer, it's more complicated and difficult, but you can't, as an honest human being, ignore one part of it or the other. You can't throw that out. As a scientist, you can't throw out the uncomfortable data. So if you're in this position, you've got to make sense of the whole thing, not
What's the
just what
uncomfortable
science
data? What uncomfortable data?
Well, let me give you an example. You're just giving this caricature that faith is simply just something to do with religion. I see faith very much in science as well. Like, for example, let's take the case of the discovery of radioactivity, where this particle was breaking up into other particles, and it appeared that energy was not conserved. Now, that would have been the obvious conclusion to come to. Energy is not conserved. Is that the conclusion that the physicists came to? Absolutely no. Why? Because they believed in the law of conservation of energy. That law has such explanatory value in other respects that they were totally reluctant to throw that away. So they shelved it. They came up with this idea that there might be some other particle, an invisible particle, taking it away. And in fact, that faith was in the end justified. The neutrino was eventually discovered. But they did not jump to the obvious conclusion because they placed their money. In the absence of proof, they placed their money on a particular conclusion because they had a particular worldview. And that is very similar to what happens in religion.
I'm sorry, it is fundamentally different. Having a worldview and placing your bets in certain directions is not like having the faith in religion. Can I ask those of you religious around it, what evidence would ever persuade you that there wasn't a God? The essence of science is that we change our mind all the time. I don't believe that any of you will accept that any evidence whatsoever would ever lead you to the belief that there is no God.
I think we can go on from that one, because I think there was some evidence in the programs that some scientists change their idea of how God is. Some scientists who believe in God change their idea of how God is according to what they find in science.
Sorry, that's not the same question. I'm asking a totally different question. I'm asking the three people here who believe in God. I'm asking them, what evidence would persuade them there was no God?
Can I
Okay,
answer
let's
that?
quickly answer that.
Because
Yeah.
I think it's a perfectly fair question to ask. And lots of people do either lose their faith in God, or people who haven't had one find it. So people do change, usually because they either begin to make sense of things or they find everything falling apart. I mean, can I ask Lewis back, do you think it's true in your experience of people you've known who've perhaps had a religious faith and then lost it, it's because they can no longer make sense of the world in terms of their religious faith?
I really can't answer that, but the sort of reasons they would give for losing their faith is nothing to do with the sort of reasons that a scientist would give for changing their mind. And I have to also remind you, I mean, I'm perfectly familiar with this, and I think it's very important to realize many, many scientists, as we have here with Russell, are deeply religious. And historically, that's absolutely true. And incidentally, curiously enough, more physicists are religious than biologists. It's a curious phenomenon there, but it is true.
Russell, can you imagine anything which might persuade you in science that there really is no God?
No, I find it very difficult to believe that, because why do I believe in God? It's because I have a relationship with God. I have a day-to-day conversation with God.
But if a psychologist could isolate the chemical which makes you feel that way...
He is so real to me that I just cannot conceive of a situation where someone could come up with a neat, pat argument which would destroy that.
But it's as though someone said, what could convince me that Lewis didn't exist?
But suppose a biochemist discovered some peculiar brain chemical which they could inject into Lewis and immediately make him say, I have a relationship with God.
Oh, that would get me worried.
And then they could say, well, look, you, Russell, happen to inherit this from your great-great-grandfather, so it's entirely psychological, chemical and genetic. Would that throw you?
I'm not sure.
Would throw Lewis, I can tell you. Right. Let us come in detail to some of the questions in the programmes. The origins of it all, the Big Bang, the way that everything seems to follow from the Big Bang all the way to humankind, and whether this spoils the idea of a designer God. Now, a lot of people you talked to, Russell, did seem to feel that God would just not have designed it in this very complicated and roundabout way. If he was going to create man, he would have created man rather than start from the Big Bang and work all the way through to us.
Well, Richard Dawkins certainly said that if he were God, he would not have used evolution to give rise to people. Well, that's Richard Dawkins playing God, I think. I think that we use science to find out what kind of God it is.
And he's a God who took this incredibly roundabout means.
Okay, well, that I think is one of the main sort of, if you like, intellectual arguments for belief in God, that he is not the kind of God one would have thought up. He keeps on taking you by... He does things in a way which I would not do things.
A mysterious way.
Like, for example, if I were God, I would create a world in which everybody had a good time. I'd be a very popular God, all right? Now... God isn't like that. People have very bad times here. For him, the important thing is not having a good time. The important characteristic is love. Now, that I find very surprising. You must then have free will in the world, so that love is something which can be offered freely. You must have suffering in the world, because otherwise there is no proof of love. And all tremendous consequences come from elevating the idea of love to a pinnacle. Now, it is such a surprising idea that I believe that this is a God that we have discovered. It's not a God that we have made up. Just as in my scientific work, time and time again, that the physical world surprises me. And it's that element of surprise which keeps on bringing home to you the fact that you're dealing with something which is other than your own imagination.
Kitty.
Well, I would agree with that, but I must say that... and here we are, we're not talking about cosmology, we're talking about Richard Dawkins, but his comment about survival of the fittest and the working out of evolution having so much pain and suffering, and I found that was really very thought-provoking.
Yes, he said basically that the cruelties of natural selection made everything point not actually to a cruel dog, but to a massively indifferent one.
That's
and in
right.
fact, I mean, Russell talks about it all being justified by love, but among the animals, which we are told by the Christian religion do not have these opportunities of redemption, the suffering is just as bad. I mean, there is suffering at every level all around us all the time, the beetles that we tread on.
I think that there is very much, in going against what Lewis was earlier saying, that there's no connection between science and religion. I think that there is big connections, and that is one of them, that I think that our understanding of origins scientifically as being through evolution certainly does make the distinction between human beings and the rest of the animal kingdom far less distinct. And I think that theologians very much do need to sort of rethink out the status of animals in the light of modern science.
I think we'll come to that. But Michael Rice, what about the business of everything evolving as from after the Big Bang? Do you buy into the anthropic principle that God sort of designed everything from the Big Bang onwards in order to create us in his image?
My understanding of the anthropic principle, I think, might be actually slightly nearer to Lewis's, perhaps, than it is to a lot of Christians.
The anthropic principle basically says that we are the point of it all.
Well, there are several different versions, I'm afraid, as there always are, of scientific theories. But my understanding of the anthropic principle is that because we are here having this conversation and people are listening to us having this conversation, the universe must have been able to give rise to us. Now, my own belief is you cannot deduce anything about whether there is a God or is not a God from the fact that we are here doing this.
Michael, what a pleasure to agree with you.
Right, good. Now, and I really feel that extremely strongly, and incidentally, I think the Church has, down the ages, been disastrous whenever it's tried not to hold that point of view. And I find it very difficult to know, in a sense, why people have religious faith. And I suppose I see it slightly as something that is very deep down from within oneself, a response. But I can't defend it in any very intellectual fashion. But I do believe and accept it.
Lewis, how do you see the story, the idea of everything happening from the Big Bang right down to Galileo, Newton, Mother Teresa and us?
First of all, what a pleasure it is to agree with Michael, because his position is identical with that of David Hume's, I can tell you. I think the ideas about the origin of the universe are really hard, and I take the position taken by Richard Feynman, who died, a much-loved physicist who died. And Richard Feynman said the following. He said, look, there are going to be things about the nature of the world and the universe we will never know. And certainly I believe that. You know, however much we understand, there will always be an inexplicable residue. But he went on to say that that's the way it is, that's the way it is, and he'd rather live with uncertainty and ignorance than believe in things for which there's no evidence. So I think it's really perplexing, the Big Bang, perplexing for everybody, and we may never know the answer.
But why do you think we as a species are here, and we as a species are so bright that we are able to think about these things and deduce things so far away from us?
There I'm with Richard Dawkins entirely. That's evolution. That's straight biology. That's
An
straight
accident.
Darwinism. Absolute accident.
We're a chemical accident.
Sorry, that's it.
And can I say that from a theological perspective, that could be seen as quite exciting. This goes back to what Russell was saying, that we can look at what's going on in the world around us and what science teaches us, and then if one has a religious faith or is open to the possibility, one can say, well, let us hypothesize that there was a God or is a God. What, if anything, could we learn about such a God? And Russell told us several things we'd learn about God. And one of the things we'd also learn, which is what you were saying, is that it is a God who takes risks, because intelligent life forms might not have evolved.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it does come up in the programmes at one stage, the idea that God might not necessarily, as it were, have known how things would turn out, that there might be a degree of a rolling of the ball and see what happens, which actually takes in both views.
Yeah, I sometimes call God the divine bookmaker. A bookmaker makes use of chance. No, he does not know who's going to win the next race. But he knows that by the end of the week he's going to have made a profit. So I think that in some respects one can look upon God as setting in train these various random mutations of the genes and things of that kind. He's got the natural selection system there, which is going to see that intelligent life is eventually in some form or another going to emerge. So he's going to achieve his ends in general. Now that is one way of looking at God, but it's only an analogy, and all analogies break down, certainly if you're applying them to God. One has at the same time to bear in mind that it is the Christian view, and one that I hold, that God has foreknowledge. So he in fact knows that it's in the end going to be humans that come out of this on this particular planet, or it's going to be something else on other planets.
Well, otherwise it spoils the idea of a designer God, doesn't it? I mean, you are actually diverging. If you talk of a bookmaker God, you're diverging quite a long way from Christian orthodoxy, because Kitty, I mean, it says designer, he knows everything, has from the beginning.
Oh, it depends on how specific the design is. If he set it up in the beginning, if he loaded the dice, so to speak, so that intelligent life would emerge. It doesn't have to be intelligent life that looks like us. It doesn't have to be intelligent life that breathes air necessarily. It just has to be something, maybe it slimes around on the ground, that responds to God. And I think Richard Dawkins actually makes a very strong argument that evolution, given the way evolution works, it's almost inevitable that eventually you will get a being like that. Now, of course, there are a lot of people who disagree with that and say it's not inevitable at all. It's very unlikely. But it seems to me that if it is inevitable, then we've set up a perfect situation where God could have set it up that way. If it's not inevitable, then maybe we need God as an explanation for why it happened. I mean, I don't think you exactly escape God by that route.
Lewis is a biologist. I mean, is it inevitable that something like us should have turned up?
I just don't know. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that.
But
Sorry.
looking at evolution, looking at your understanding of biology.
I just don't think I think you assume that we understand biology better. I think there's a large number of contingent events in evolution. Maybe if we'd been hit by an asteroid at the time of the dinosaurs and it had wiped out all of life, maybe you'd never had human beings. And by the way, I must say I find this discussion, I sort of feel I'm in a medieval scholastic debate, God the gambler, God the designer. And by the way, why is all the attention on Christianity? There are dozens of religions. Oh, they're all nonsense. Oh, they're all junk as far as this group is concerned.
The answer is no, but perhaps we're better informed about one, and one naturally tends to speak about what one knows most. But in fact,
no one's talked about Christ at all, actually. Everyone has simply talked about the God, who is actually common to all the
If we're
great
talking
religions.
about a creator God,
Exactly.
it's
I
very
don't
common.
know. What about Buddhism? No God in Buddha.
Can I tell you some good news about beetles?
Yes.
Because I feel more confident about that, and it's very important. This is the argument of Richard Dawkins and dear old Charles Darwin, who felt upset about all these beetles getting trodden underfoot, all these awful parasitic wasps. There is actually less suffering in the world than most of us suppose. To suffer, which is something humans can do, and I'm sure a lot of mammals and birds, to suffer requires, and Lewis can come in on here as a biologist, requires quite an impressive brain. It requires some degree of self-consciousness. I love beetles, but I don't think they suffer. They don't actually, by the way, enjoy life either. That's the other side of it. Because
the Beatles would like this at all.
How do we know that you need such a brain to suffer?
Because in all seriousness, I think that both at an academic level, if you try and work out what suffering is, it has to involve some degree of self-consciousness. And it's very difficult, honestly, to argue the beetles have got this. And most neuroendocrinologists and neurophysiologists
Okay, so
think they have.
perhaps we exempt God from causing some suffering, but I think before we leave this extremely difficult and, Lewis is right, mildly embarrassing area of trying to deduce the personality of God from what science knows. What
Mildly
about
embarrassing.
this business of
Yes.
the hide-and-seek God? I mean, there was a certain air
Yes.
of pique among some of the scientists who talked to, who sort of said, well, if God did this, you know, he was covering his tracks, you know, why does he cover his tracks like this? You
Can
know,
I come in there?
Why can't he be more upfront?
Absolutely certain, I'm convinced by the answer to this. God couldn't be upfront about it because it's this same old point. You see, if Lewis would again allow me to say so, I think God rather loves Lewis. But God is a rather
That's
high...
really upset him.
God has a very high opinion of him, and God treats Lewis a bit as many of us treat children. You know they're not as wise as they sometimes think they are.
Are you saying that God set all this up as a kind of maze for Lewis to grope his way through?
And he's got a 50-50 chance.
To him. Russell, do you accept this kind of, question master, puzzle-setting, krypton factor God of Michael's?
Well, I think that as soon as you accept the idea that God is a God of love, and that for whatever reason he has made that the most important reason for why we're here, then he's got to adopt, as someone said, a hands-off approach. He's got to give us freedom to be ourselves in order that we can respond to him. It's a very loving kind of idea.
Can I interrupt? What on earth do you mean by a God of love?
A God who has a personal relationship with us.
Where's the love bit come?
That he wants the best for us.
Doesn't do much about it, does he?
In my life, he has certainly done a great deal. Thank you very much.
But what about other people?
You cannot look at this life and see it as a life in which everybody has love and justice, which then brings us to the fourth program, which is to do with an afterlife. Now, Jocelyn Burnell took me to task on my belief in an afterlife. She said, jam tomorrow. My reaction to that is, well, why not jam tomorrow? You know, the God I believe in is a good God, he's a loving God, a powerful God, and it would only be consistent if things in the end sorted themselves out. Now, as they are not completely sorting themselves out by any means in this life, one's only got to think about the children in Dunblane, for example, then there has to be something more.
What I wonder, Lewis, is how you explain this historic sort of endless, in every culture, this sort of upward trend, this tendency of people to look for a God. Sure. The fact that everything with intelligence has always searched for a God. I mean, you may hate the people who are doing it at the moment around this table, but you must admit it is an enormously strong need and desire to believe.
Question.
So why is it necessarily all hokum?
Please, I'm not anti-religious. I mean, I don't wish to dissuade people from being religious, and I think for many people it's enormously comforting and it can, for many people, provide a moral sense.
It's only comforting for them if it's true. If you keep saying it's not true, then the comfort goes.
No, on the contrary. One doesn't dissuade people. It is about faith, as I keep on saying. You know, the idea that science undermines religion is very poorly based. I mean, 95% of people in America, very scientific culture, still believe in some form of God. But I don't have a simple explanation, and lots of people have thought about why there is so much religion in the world. And it's something to do with we live in a complex environment. There's death, which isn't very pleasant, and one needs explanations as to origins and finalities and purposes, and religion gives you this.
Well, let's talk about what religion is for and should be for in this new world we have around us, which is defined by science. It seems to me that we can no longer, as the ancients could, kneel and look up at the stars in the sky or look at a flower and say, God is wonderful, he made this, because we have to sort of say, oh, clouds of gas and dust and stuff like that. It's all been found out about. It seems to me that therefore religion is actually changing, is becoming much more sort of touchy-feely, much more tolerant, much less absolute.
You can probably tell from the reaction around the table, and many of us are not feeling so comfortable about your premise. Give an example. If somebody loves me and I love that other person, I'm not bothered at all by a psychologist being able to tell me quite a lot about the source of that love and its manifestations. It doesn't worry me at all. But I might still carry on loving that person and perhaps being loved by them.
Do you think religion is changing, needs to change, to adapt to a world which is so much more defined by science than it used to be?
I think that is a very, very difficult question. Depends on what you see as religion in the first place that's got to change. I was brought up as a child in a very religious family, but also a very scientific, interested family. Never thought there was any conflict between the two. Hashed these things out at the dinner table and came home from church every Sunday arguing about the sermon and this and that and all of that. It wasn't until my late 40s that I really began to look seriously at science, fully expecting to find that there would be some contradictions with my belief, and really did a pretty serious exploration of especially those theories that I thought were going to be the greatest threat to belief. And really, much to my surprise, found that they certainly didn't rule out belief in God and ruled out very little of Orthodox religion. Now, maybe I'm a wishy-washy person because I don't insist that Genesis is necessarily literal. If I insisted on that, then I'd have to maybe change that. But I guess my belief in the first place was such that I haven't had to change it in response to what I've learned in science.
Yes, but what was, for example, very apparent in the programmes, Russell, was the way that scientific people shift uneasily from foot to foot when miracles are mentioned. That was difficult, wasn't it?
That
miracles
was
is difficult, yes.
I think that...
Impossible.
Well, that's what you say. I wouldn't like to be so dogmatic myself. No, with laws of nature, what we find is that most happenings are law governed. It's a big step then to say that everything has to be law governed. I think that is a concept which ancient people did not have. They just saw everything as the kind of the act of God, and they didn't think that God had to constrain himself to work in reproducible patterns. Well, now we know that things do happen in reproducible patterns. So I think that if they had had more of a scientific understanding in those days, or 2,000 years ago, they would have been more critical about claiming miracles than they actually were. So, yes, I think that has changed our attitude, that God certainly isn't as much hands-on as people used to think. And so that has changed our idea about God.
Though I rather liked in one of the programs where it was pointed out, there's two senses of the word miracle. One that everybody would be comfortable with, which is what most people think is a rather loose sense of something being wonderful. So people talk about the birth of children being miraculous. And in one sense, it is wonderful. It is something, mirabile, to be marvelled at. But of course, what we're mostly talking about is the more technical sense of miracle, something that contravenes the laws of nature. And it is an intellectually perfectly respectable position to hold, as Lewis has done, that doesn't happen. Now, for what it's worth, I think miracles do happen, but I don't think you get as many of them nowadays as you once did. And you can probably see why I think that is, because, again, let us suppose there is a God. It's all right turning water into wine at a single wedding a long time ago, because all the historical records for it will be a bit, iffy, and it's not going to threaten Lewis's autonomy, those stories. But imagine somebody turned water into wine now, and utterly convincingly, on prime-time television with you chairing discussion groups afterwards. And it was incontrovertible.
Jancis Robinson tasting it, yes.
I'm afraid we could even have that.
What would be wrong with that?
Because it would put you... Just imagine it really happened.
It'd be amazing.
Now,
Well,
what would you do? What would you conclude?
Let me face the sort of issue that I'd like to face when I
Yes.
actually meet it.
You wouldn't like to comment now?
Certainly not.
Well, let me say what I think would happen. Not necessarily to you, of course, but to other people. They'd have to do one of two things. They'd either be forced into saying, oh, well, I suppose there is something outside of the laws of nature, call it a creator if you like. Or else they'd have to just disbelieve their evidence.
Lewis, you've hinted that in the scientific community, physicists seem actually rather more likely to be
yes.
believers
They are.
than biologists and
Yes.
psychologists. Why do you think that
I don't know
is?
about psychologists, I've no idea. But I don't know. I suppose physics is that more mysterious. I mean, when you get into quantum mechanics, about which I know nothing, and the Big Bang, it is absolutely weird and remarkable and miraculous, and I can understand them wanting to have this feeling. Whereas we biologists have the illusion at the moment, we really understand evolution and how cells work and how embryos develop, and we feel more comfortable. But that's just a very quick answer. I really don't
Yes, I can
know.
understand that, Lewis. But I asked that question in the series, I think it was with Richard Dawkins, and I found it surprising that you, as a biologist, perhaps don't have as much sense of awe and wonder at the quality of life. Surely there's something mysterious about life. Wouldn't that trigger you into thinking deep thoughts? What's the meaning of it all?
No, we want to understand it. It's marvelous and exciting. But that doesn't mean to say that there's cells, which is the essence of life, which are the essence of life, are nothing more than complicated chemistry.
Okay. Well, then, can I ask you this? It's always been my assumption that at least part of the reason why biologists seem to have it in for religious people is that there are certain religious people who attack you and your science, namely creation scientists.
Ah, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Now, I try to imagine myself being a biologist, and if I were in your position, I would be absolutely fed up to the back teeth with creation scientists.
Quite right,
I
I
would
am.
say, what the blazes are these people doing, telling me, a scientist,
Yes.
what is...
No, they're
something-
doing bad science.
They're doing thoroughly bad science. Now, is there something of a kind of backlash from biologists against creation scientists? And are you labeling us all religious people, as being that kind of literalist?
No, we're not. Certainly, creationism isn't strong in this country. It's much stronger in America.
That's right.
It's a major problem in America, and the biologists try to deal with it as best they can. Whenever religion starts to speak about the natural world and gets into conflict with science, then of course it's going to be wrong, or it will be an agreement, and there can be no conflict between religion and science in dealing with the natural world. What religion's about it, as you've described around this table, it's your relationship with God, and that's absolutely fine by me.
But
But
you know,
when-
the scientists, insist on the discussion more than the religious people do. You see book after book that really is a marvelous science book, but has an anti-religious or a religious, not necessarily anti-religious, tag in it. And they insist on bringing it up. It's, who referred to it as the obligatory God ending.
It sells books.
Yeah.
Yes.
But do,
well,
but do you feel, Lewis, when you are in your discipline in biology,
Yes.
when you are lurking around on that remarkable borderline between man and animals, I think it's something like one gene out of who knows how many, which separates
trust
us,
that.
which separates us
That's
from the apes.
Amazing.
It's extraordinary. You know, you
Yes.
have a human baby and a baby monkey, and not much to
Yes.
choose between them, and then suddenly, even days later, there is enormous everything to choose between them.
It's a wonderful problem.
And you don't have, you don't accept the possibility of any answer to that problem in terms of what religious people would call the soul.
Certainly not.
So what do you call it?
Well, we've got to try and understand what it is about the difference between the genes between apes and ourselves that makes us human and them apes. And we don't understand that. It's a great deal to do with the brain, and presumably we'll get onto the brain in a moment, and we don't know an awful lot about the brain.
And as you can imagine, Libby, I might have a slightly different slant. What I find so interesting when I watch, like everybody else, Jane Goodall on television with her chimps, or I watch David Attenborough with elephants at an elephant graveyard, is one sees the beginnings in these other creatures. One sees the beginnings of what it is to be persons, which is what humans are, asking the deeper questions. And I do believe that this evolved and
From
evolved.
the animals.
If that's right.
Well, now this does bring us to questions to ask the religious people at the table, because the old Judeo-Christian line has been very hard on the animals, really, and on the natural world. We rule it. It's there for us. We do what the heck we like with it. There seems to be a growing feeling now among religious people, and unease at that, a sense that, no, actually, we're part of a continuum, and that the relationship between us and animals, us and the natural world, has to be religiously different, as well as different in terms of just good husbandry.
I think the idea of ruling it somehow also includes having to care for it.
It's
But,
part of it. It's by no means all of it. I mean,
No.
it's like the medieval thing, the mortification of the flesh. You cast aside the world, the flesh, and
Well,
the
that's
devil.
the flesh. It's not
And
really the animals.
Well, it's the
necessarily.
animal side of yourself. I mean, there is a long, isn't there, religious tradition of dislike of the flesh.
Oh, yes, yeah. I think that, Kitty is right, that there always has been in traditional Judeo-Christian the idea that we are here to care for things. Adam and Eve, in that mythological story, were put into the garden not to have a good time, but to look after it. And so that, you've almost got the kind of inkling there of the green message there. Okay, since that time, that understanding got lost somewhere along the line, and we did have this ruling and getting what you can out of the environment, and perhaps we're now recapturing some of that early truth.
Lewis, sometimes there are ethical arguments brought forward against some of the things biologists do to nature. They're not drawn from religion. What are they? Are they drawn from our closeness to the animal kingdom?
No, I think they're drawn from the society in which we live. I think the origins of morality is a complex issue, and certainly we are very influenced by a Judeo-Christian morality. It's not what biologists do to animals, it's what we do to animals. Like we feed cows other cows. So it's not just about science.
But how would you set about creating a framework? And would it be different to the way the religious people would set about creating a framework of ethics for dealing with the animal kingdom?
I don't think that the ethics that you would have for the animal kingdom would be necessarily all that different from the ethics you would have for human beings. I don't think you want to be... I think it's a difficult issue. Should we even eat meat? My position is perfectly clear. Science tells you nothing whatsoever about morals and ethics. You've got to get it from somewhere else.
I think I do partly agree with that, because you can't deduce what we ought to do.
Yeah.
This is a very well-known point from what's going on in the world around us. But nevertheless, as I'm sure we probably all agree, one thing that science has done is to suggest that some of the barriers between men and women and other species are a bit less than people supposed. That was my point about the Jane Goodall films. And it's simply that, I didn't know much 20 years ago about chimps. And now, of course, one realizes that what one does to a chimp, in the way one treats it, is pretty much like doing that to an adolescent human.
That you'd go that far?
I probably would if pushed.
The last thing I'd like to come to is what Russell ends the book accompanying this series with, which is a reiteration of his very strong feeling that one of the important things, both in science and religion, and one of the areas where they cannot help but cross, whatever Lewis says, is the sense of wonder. I mean, your religious sense of wonder is really very close to what you feel as a physicist, isn't it? That you feel the roots.
Oh, yes,
are
I think
one.
that as a physicist, and particularly a physicist of the type who is concerned with trying to understand the basic fundamental nature of space and time and matter, you're continually faced not only with the normal kinds of scientific problems of, here is something which you're trying to understand, but from time to time you come up against what I call the barrier of the knowable. You get to a point where you think, gosh, I don't even know what question I should be asking. My normal sort of reasoning has completely broken down. And I think that really does bring one up with a start when you are facing something where you think, gosh, I think that nobody ever will be able to answer these questions.
Lewis's response to one of these barriers is to push hard, isn't it? Is not to fall down and worship and then push hard, as I suspect Russell would, because you, again, want to push back the frontiers of knowledge. But your instinct is just to push hard and never mind the wonder.
Absolutely. There's nothing more wonderful than the development of an embryo. You come from a single-cell egg. It's absolutely astonishing. Well, you can sit back and sort of say, wow. But the other thing is to actually find out how to do it, how it does it. And we're doing extremely well.
Don't you
Yes,
think
but
that
I would say that your science is very much an applied science.
Oh, no, it's not.
I'm afraid that from my perspective as a pure physicist,
I'm as pure as you,
yours
sir.
is a very applied science. You're not really dealing with what I would regard as being truly fundamental problems where you don't even understand what language to use.
I beg your pardon. I have never been so insulted in my... No, Russell, I simply couldn't accept that at all. I think understanding how cells work is absolutely fundamental. Understanding that DNA is
important, but
no, not important, fundamental in biology. I think this is the arrogance of physics.
No, I think it's actually coming up against such things as quantum physics,
I agree.
where you are faced there with the fundamental questions of can you in fact say anything about a world that you are not observing? Now that I would regard as really fundamental.
All right, maybe we're
getting
not
to a-
quite as fundamental.
We're getting to a-
pretty fundamental.
This is like a playground fight, What I study is smaller than what you study. What I study is smaller than... So I think we suppose we now say, well, God is the smallest of all and the largest,
That's right.
and so on. Just very briefly, Kitty, a sense of wonder, is that something that is important to
Yes,
you?
it is. And I would like to point to one of the statements that was made right at the beginning of the programs by one of your teenagers. He spoke of now that we have this nice 20th century intelligence. And when I heard him say that, and that this didn't allow him anymore to believe in God, I wanted to ask the question that C.S. Lewis's professor asks in the Chronicles of Narnia. What do they teach them in these schools? Because it seems that is science only a bunch of facts, a bunch of things that we know, a bunch of no-nos, and a bunch of limits on our expectations about what can happen in the universe? I mean, what's happened to our sense of wonder? What's happened to the joy of being out there on the outer edge and reaching out and grasping something, and it's surprising and it's wonderful? I mean, what's happened to the... I love your comment about something being a wonderful problem. And I'd like to speak of the glorious ignorance of science. I mean, it's the leading edge.
I think Kitty puts that beautifully. There's the little bit of me that's an educationalist, though, that doesn't want too much teaching about awe and wonder in schools, because we're beginning to get it, and I have a horrible feeling that one may then lose any chance of anybody ever feeling any awe and wonder ever again.
Because it's in school.
Yeah. And just let me explain briefly. Most of us have very few times in our lives when we really feel a deep sense of what some people would call awe, others would call reverence. And they come on to us without us expecting
Well,
them.
we must wind up now. I suspect the answer to what do they teach them in schools depends which of our panel fights their way in to start teaching it first. They have been Professor Russell Stannard, Lewis Wolpert, Michael Rice and Kitty Ferguson. Thanks to all of you.